committee entitled Curriculum and Student Learning. We're very excited that you chose this session. And before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce and thank the members of this subcommittee who have worked hard to make today's event possible. So Dr. Sarah Aldifer, Dr. Karen Brazelton, Katie Deckard, Jamie Singleton, Dr. John Thurgood, and Dr. Megan Unversaw. This group has been incredibly dedicated to supporting teaching and learning across our campus, and today's session is a great example of that commitment. A quick note about the format. Dr. Birdwell has graciously agreed to make this an interactive session, so please feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll be using the Zoom's Q&A feature, so simply type your question into the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, and we will make sure Dr. Birdwell sees them. We want this to be a conversation, not just a presentation. I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Brazelton, who will introduce our speaker. Karen?
Thank you. And as a member of the subcommittee, Dr. Regal, I thank you as well. And welcome again to everyone joining us today. It is truly my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tracey Birdwell. Dr. Birdwell serves as the Assistant Director of the Center for Instructional Excellence at Purdue University's Indianapolis campus, where she is working to build an innovative teaching culture at this fast-growing campus. Her areas of interest include learning spaces, scaling student engagement in large enrollment courses, and the future of higher education. Dr. Birdwell is a scholar and thought leader in the field of teaching and learning. She frequently publishes and speaks about learning spaces, student success, and teaching excellence. Her work has appeared in EDUCAUSE Quarterly, EDUCAUSE Review, Innovative Higher Education, the Journal of Learning Spaces, Campus Technology, the Journal on Centers for Teaching and Learning, the Journal of Applied Research in Higher Education, and The Conversation. One of the things that really drew us to Dr. Birdwell's work is her understanding that effective active learning strategies don't require fancy, specialized classrooms or cutting-edge technology. Her research and experience show that these approaches can work in any teaching environment, whether that's a traditional lecture hall, an online course, a lab, or anywhere else that we find ourselves teaching. We're so grateful that Dr. Birdwell is taking the time to share her insights with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tracey Birdwell. Dr. Birdwell.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Cynthia. What a wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and shift over to sharing slides. So, and we'll get started. Good. Let's see. Give me a moment for the technology to break in. And if anybody has a suggestion, let's see. Oh, there we go. I think if that's okay with you, I will take me off of this as well. And I will move this down to the bottom. And so again, thank you for this introduction. I want to take a moment to do a sound check. I want to make sure you can hear me. And if there's something off with the sound, please break in. And while we're doing this, I want to remind everyone, I love interactivity in these sessions. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question at any point. I do have some moments to stop for questions, but you don't have to wait for those moments. I think in these sorts of conversations about practical application and images of all these different classroom types, I think it's great to be able to share the moments as they strike. And today I want to talk about my experiences as an instructor myself. My PhD is in American history, so my earliest moments in the classroom were teaching in them. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how I transformed some traditional spaces to meet my needs to support student engagement and to engage all students in the class and give them access to the conversations, to me, to one another, and to the materials that were part of my course to a greater degree than what I had experienced in some classrooms I've had before. I also want to talk about how some of those early lessons learned really informed the work I did when I led the Mosaic Initiative, which was an active learning initiative focused on our active learning classroom. So I got to take these lessons from traditional spaces into these new active learning classrooms that a lot of us are experiencing. And I want to talk with you a little bit about what is possible and how some of these active learning classrooms that we built really inspire us to take lessons into all of our spaces. So let me go ahead and get started. And this is a moment where I would love to hear from you. And this is a great way to kind of get started and get our bearings. So we'll have 2 activities to start. And then I want to talk a little bit about learning spaces and active learning in those learning spaces. So you're looking at 2 classrooms. This does happen to be an IU classroom. By the way, I know I've got IU classroom and the Purdue branding, but I've worked at both institutions, and I assure you I'm not from Indiana. So I love all Indiana universities, and I think we should all win, all the sports. So, but this is where I want to ask you, that's totally fine. What are you seeing in these 2 classrooms? How are students learning in these 2 classrooms? And please feel free to break in.
Well, I definitely see interaction on the left side there with the small group.
I agree, Karen. On the left side, you see students leaning in to each other and discussing things, kind of get in the middle of something. It kind of looks like they're very interested in whatever they're talking about or discussing.
They could be interested on the right side, the larger lecture hall, but there's more limited interaction with each other. Jamie says we can put comments in the chat. I don't see any yet.
I have Kathy Lay saying question answer. Students on the right look engaged too. They're definitely focused on the same thing. Definitely on the right, you see the instructor or someone that is presenting. I'm not sure on the left, I could pick out who is maybe presenting or leading. They all look like they're contributing.
So I like to show these spaces. I'm gonna hide us again because I don't want anybody to feel like they're being watched during their conversation. I like to share these 2 photos to show that classroom space influence how we engage one another and how our students can engage. I would argue that the classroom on the right, the lecture style classroom, is actually, they appear quite engaged. But what students can do in the course, how they can interact with one another, how they might interact with the instructor looks different. We can learn and we can engage in all spaces, but sometimes the spaces allow for certain engagements. And sometimes you have to take a space and turn it into something that works for you. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I do want to show you a photo. On the left-hand side, you can see like a piece of a space that actually looks like this. So we have a large enrollment or a large seating space, and that fits 96 students. So I'm going to come back to that image in just a moment, but this is what we're looking at. An instructor could really be anywhere. Now, I am going to ask everyone to do something at their desks. And if you like to jot things down on a piece of paper, or if you want to pull out your phone and create a note. But I'm going to ask you all, I'm going to give you 2 minutes and I'll time it. One of the things that I have noticed when I work with faculty with active learning and with the literature is so often we'll read, I don't know, a dozen articles in the course of their tenure with me. And many of the articles don't define active learning, or they'll define it as not lecture. And I think that can be kind of a challenge when we are talking about a thing and it's such an umbrella term that its broadness can make it difficult to figure out how these approaches work for us. So I'm going to ask everyone, and I'm going to time 2 minutes. So we'll have a little bit of silence. 2 minutes. I want you to define active learning for yourself and in your discipline. And it may look different for different groups. We'll come back to this. And yes, I do have my definition. I'll share later. But I'm going to take 2 minutes and I'm going to ask you all to write a 1 sentence or so description. What is active learning for you? Have about 30 seconds left. All right, so thank you so much for indulging. Keep your definition close by, and hopefully we'll have time to share what we all have thought of. And I know that mine is really focused on the fact that I'm a historian and I teach courses with that disciplinary mindset. So we'll come back to that towards the end, and thank you. We're going to talk today about active learning classrooms. We're going to talk about teaching in active learning in all learning spaces, but I wanted to give a brief background and then sort of scope out to give a sense of what's happening kind of all over higher ed, but do it in a very brief amount of time. So I want to talk about where the active learning classrooms as we understand them right now in the 21st century are, where they're coming from. And really they come from a movement that started in the late 90s for some STEM classrooms. I do want to take a moment to say we have had classroom designs based on active learning concepts for many years. Look at a Montessori classroom, look at a design studio for architecture, an art studio. So we've had spaces that support pedagogies and hands-on active learning pedagogies. But the active learning classroom sort of conversation that we're involved in right now, I just wanted to give you sort of the historical basis for this one. The one that started with the concept of the scale-up classroom. So we get the active learning classrooms as we understand them from scale-up. So sometime in the mid to late 90s at MIT, some of the physics instructors were looking for ways to better engage students. They would lecture in the physics lecture and then engage students in the lab. And they were finding that it seemed like students understood the content when it came to the lecture, but once they got to lab, sort of all was lost. And they were trying to figure out ways to bring lecture and lab together, which is like a registrar issue, of course, but also a space issue. And so this is where scale-up classrooms were born. And this is where first active learning classrooms were born. Scale-up originally stood for student-centered active learning environment, undergraduate physics. That was the original descriptor of that acronym. And so the idea for Scale Up is students would experience lecture and lab together in one space and in one like block of time. And so Scale Up classrooms have a very specific measurements in terms of how far away tables are from each other. They are 9 students at a table with groupings of 3 as well. So you could do small group, large group. The idea too in these classrooms early on is that they were technology enhanced. So usually these early classrooms had 3 computer screens that also attached a wall screen. So the students had access to technology, which in the early 90s was a little bit more cutting edge than it is right now. So tech enhanced, collaborative work, students have access to the materials, and instructors could walk around the room and see how far along students were in understanding the material. You can see that the location right here of the instructor station was also in the center of the room, with the idea being let's decenter the lecture. It's about hands-on learning, guide on the side, approach to supporting students' learning. And so that's sort of where this is all coming from. And it really caught on. But as you might see, I mentioned physics. This was very much a STEM movement early on in the late 1990s and early 2000s. That's the University of Minnesota. They created a whole building based on active learning classrooms and that scale-up design. I remember being there sort of in the early days of it being built, and it was really fascinating. They were inviting all sorts of disciplines and approaches to figure out new ways to teach in the scale-up design, where you sort of have hands-on work and a decentered lecture station. But what also started to evolve is instead of just thinking about lecture and lab, instead of just thinking about STEM, we began to be in higher ed inspired about how to explore designs for all of our spaces. So I'm just going to show you just a few concepts, and then we'll get into like practicality. This is from Oregon State. This is the lecture and the round. This is the goal to build a better lecture hall. That's my phrasing. I just kind of like how do you build a better lecture hall? The seats 500 students, but the rows go back only 12. So it's only 12 rows, and it feels like the most intimate playhouse you could be part of. It does not feel, I've been here, it does not feel like 500 people. Of course, you can see that the slides are in a circle all the way around. That stage, that's truly, you know, the instructor on the stage, that stage imperceptibly rotates throughout the course, so that if the instructor wants to stand in one location, students will feel like they're in front of the instructor and the instructor is facing them the entire class. And the idea is that the instructor is close to students. There's a concept of proxemics, and the idea that if students feel like they're close to the professor, they will feel like they belong. So it's a goal to sort of scale intimacy. And one fun fact is just off of the room is a green room. And in the green room are 2 computers, computer 1 and computer 2. So when the instructor is on stage and they're, say, on computer 1, the instructor that's about to come to the next course is able to prepare all of their materials on computer 2. And then when they go up onto the stage, they just press a button, it switches over, which completely removes all that prep time, especially when students are coming to you. So I just wanted to show you like the possibilities of these big classes. And this is a classroom. I'm going to invite you to all put in the chat what discipline you think this classroom is. Who's teaching in here? Like guess in the chat, and then I will tell you. And this is a classroom I found on some travels in Sydney, Australia. I'll let you all see the chat. I actually just talked about this with a group of undergraduates, and one of them guessed that it's an economics classroom because because money is green. And I reminded them money isn't green everywhere. There's a hand. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
We saw, we've got somebody who said math, introductory classes, cinema, a calculus class.
I love that. This is psychology. With the idea that
Someone guessed psychology.
oh, then they're correct. You win the gold star for today. The idea that this is a soothing color. I like to call it the watermelon classroom, but yeah, the idea that color matters. So we're seeing different universities kind of come off of the idea of the scale up classroom and exploring different ways to make space support student learning or to support different types of engagement. And for those who are involved in STEM, I wanted to show you, this is McGill University. And so typically, at least when I was an undergraduate and I had my one lab as an undergraduate, because again, I'm a historian, I remember the long rows. It's hard to kind of walk around and to get to people. And sometimes it was difficult for the TA or the person in charge of the lab to reach everyone. This is a lab designed to allow everyone in the room to gather around one location, one experiment. Perhaps a group of students are struggling, then that becomes kind of the theater for explaining a concept to everyone. This is a huge lab. I think we're looking at a quarter of it, and there's an upstairs and downstairs. So as we're seeing, and I'm making this very quick, we're looking across the board at different universities all over the world are really rethinking basic assumptions about how our spaces are built. And just the last space I want to show you, because I think it's great to see what's out there and what's possible and what conversations other people are having. This is at Tulane, so New Orleans. This is an outdoor classroom. And it's one of my favorite stories because students decided they needed an outdoor, completely low-tech space. So imagine when you want to have class outside and the weather is nice, there's a schedulable location that instructors can take their students outside. The tables are perfect if somebody is a wheelchair user, and all spaces are available. The students funded it themselves. They raised the money. It was $990,000, just shy of $100,000 to create, and they were they completed it, I want to say 2019. So it ended up being a space quite utilized soon after, and we all know why. But I just wanted to show you these conversations about space that are happening again across the world. And one of the reasons I'm here today is around 2015, Indiana University, hired me to work with instructors in their active learning classrooms. Starting in 2015, Indiana began building a variety of active learning classrooms, but they had moved away from that scale-up design. In fact, I wouldn't say that Indiana built their true scale-up classroom until about 2020. So for about 5 years, we're building active learning classrooms across all of our undergraduate serving campuses. Some are quite high tech, like the early scale up classrooms, but many were low tech. In fact, we built more low tech classrooms as we started building classrooms because instructors were asking for low tech. The number one technology they asked for was more whiteboards in the spaces. And so Indiana had a very variegated approach to classroom design. And I would say by the end of 10 years, when I left the initiative to seek opportunities at Purdue and Indianapolis, we had begun looking for ways to make small changes to all classrooms rather than focus on a couple of premier classrooms. So it was a real transformation and conversation about active learning classrooms and active learning approaches. And that was one of my goals, is to make sure we knew that we could do active learning anywhere, not just in these special classrooms. And I just want to take a beat if you have any questions about sort of that background or history. And next, I'm going to go into practical applications for thinking about a space, doing active learning in spaces that are not built for that. But I wanted to take a beat for any questions. And if there are none, that's okay. No pressure to the group. Well, Jamie, I'm going to move forward if there aren't any questions in the chat. Oh, it looks like.
We had a question wondering how some of these projects were funded.
That's a good question. It was different on different campuses in terms of like capital funds. I would say this, we had a very powerful AVP in learning technologies who was the wind behind the sails of getting people excited about learning spaces. Stacey Maroney, I don't know if people know her in Bloomington. And so I really think I have to say I credit Stacey for every Mosaic classroom we built and for the initiative being quite strong. So usually capital funds, most often we were able to, when a classroom needed to be refreshed, we were able to try to bring in new stakeholders and to say, well, is there something really small we can add? For example, again, the instructors wanted more whiteboards. And so in some cases, no Mosaic classroom could be owned by a department. It had to be general inventory, although there are certainly active learning classrooms owned by departments. And so general capital planning is where we mostly were, but we also were opportunistic, and anytime a classroom came up for a refresh, we were able to try to push this conversation forward. What really was helpful was we had a lot of instructors who became Mosaic Fellows, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And they became really activated and engaged on active learning classrooms. We would go into a variety of spaces. I made sure they touched or were aware of all sorts of analog and high technologies. So instructors are really helping to move the conversation along, which I believe actually that's the group that needs to be at the table, if not leading the table, because they are in fact using the rooms and making learning successful in those spaces. So I hope that answers the question. And I'll go ahead and move forward. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is my personal journey, but I think there's some lessons to be learned from teaching in spaces that are not active learning classrooms, that are not the big, beautiful, photogenic spaces that we see from this active learning classroom conversation that is still spread across the globe, that really started in the 90s in a STEM-based environment, and how it's really expanded for us to all access. So this is the first classroom I ever taught in. Remember, I'm a historian. I was a TA, which means there was a lecture, a traditional lecture in a traditional space. And this was the discussion section. And I know you've all had this experience, whether you've taught in this space or you've learned in a space like this and had that graduate student experience of supporting. I was terrified to teach for the first time. I was certain that I shouldn't lecture to these students. I was not confident that I would be capable of doing that. I like to tell people that I was 21 when I first started teaching. And the week before I started my first class, I ran into somebody in a grocery store and they asked me how old I was. Or they asked me what grade I was in. And they guessed sophomore in high school. So I didn't feel super confident or like a terrific authority in the space. And so from a deficits perspective, I thought, well, how can I hide the fact that I don't feel like I should be in front of the students? But also I was concerned that in a room like this, the student sitting in the back wouldn't engage. So with my fear of my lack of authority, combined with my desire to make sure there was no back of the room and that students couldn't hide and they had equal access to everything we were talking about, I decided I needed to hack the classroom and change the space in order to change the dynamics. Again, it was coming from a perspective of how do I make this work and how do I hide my seeming lack of authority? And so one of the first things I started to do was I started thinking about my lesson plans, and I found that I started incorporating space in the lesson plan immediately. I like to say I looked for ways to make the classroom embody the lesson. So for example, again, historian, often teaching like the first half of the American History Survey. I remember very early on teaching a lesson about the British colonists and British Empire. And I thought, okay, I don't want to lecture. I don't want to stand in front of people, and I don't want to have a back in the room. So I made everyone face one another to talk about these two groups of people and how they were engaged and how we reached, war and how we reached revolution. So very simply had British colonists and the British Empire facing each other. And I kind of stood off to the side and I would lob questions. Sometimes I would go into the middle if I needed to get more attention. And in this way, I started to realize, like, okay, I get everyone involved. There was no back of the classroom. A few weeks later, we did Frederick Douglass, and I needed to have 4 themes because that was the goal of the instructor. And so I thought, great, I'll rearrange the classroom for 4 themes. And when we have whole group discussion, I'll bring us all together. So each time I try to think of ways how that the classroom could visualize the lesson in some capacity, or at least the approach. What I found was, because I changed the classroom every time we went in, and yes, sometimes there were lecture portions, the students started to get used to moving the classroom around. And so they would come in and immediately look to me and say, how are we setting up today? Professor Birdwell. And they would jump in. And one of the things I did was I realized I have buy-in from the students immediately because they're ready to prepare the lesson. The student population mixed up. There was no, this is my seat or this is my section. It also meant the students, engaged with one another more. They weren't sitting next to the same person over and over and over again. And so in creating the space in a way that made sense for me and for the lesson, that allowed me to make sure everyone was engaged and also decentered me from the classroom. Again, I did it out of fear for being a poor lecturer, but I realized I was really gaining confidence in engaging the students. And another thread that I came to realize is I started making a lesson plan, which is something in the K-12 world you're very used to, but graduate school, humanities, no one was really sharing this with me. And I started to realize I was making these lesson plans and having a whole column for the classroom or the tools used in the space, because it was so important to figure out how I was using the classroom for each lesson. Even if, maybe the classroom couldn't do exactly what I wanted, I was constantly trying to figure out where students are sitting, how students are sharing. Did I use the whiteboard or blackboards last time with chalkboards at the time? Chalkboards last time. Did I group them in 2s last time or 4s? I was constantly trying to change things up and keep it fresh and exciting. And I like to say that my students always knew and felt there was a guarantee that we would engage the reading. They just never knew exactly how we were going to do it. And so it was a great way to keep them on their toes, but also keep them comfortable because they knew we were going to engage. And that was a certainty. So the first time I actually was instructor of record, this was my classroom. Seats about 200 and something. It was a summer course, 6 weeks. The enrollment was 9. So I was, while the classroom didn't really fit what I wanted to do in the first instance, I was able to change and evolve the classroom to fit my needs. I like to say I hacked the classroom to do what I needed to do. This space was absolutely fixed and it wasn't anything I could do. And in fact, the enrollment of the course made 0 sense for the space. And had I not been an early graduate student, I might have asked for another space. I just didn't think I had the power to do that. So I did hack the space again. With 9 students, I brought them into what I call it the power space. I consider the front of the room where the podium and the blackboard, whiteboard, screens, whatever you have up front. I call that the power space. So I started inviting students into the power space. So we do activities up there. We would use the chalkboard. We would often use the aisles or the back of the room. We just changed the room. We didn't follow the suggestion of the room that they sit in chairs and I lecture from the front. And so yet again, it was a moment of, maybe I could change this. Maybe I could have some flexibility because my instructional goals did not meet the space, or the space didn't meet my instructional needs. And then the very next time I taught, same course, everything the same. but I taught in a classroom like this. And it was a reminder that space matters. Space affects what you can do. I think it was a 63-seater and I had 62 students. And so very early on, I realized I don't have access to, in this instance, I couldn't move the students around the room so easily because we were tightly packed. And so I had to think about, how do I pivot? How do I change? How do I teach an everyday class that's 1 hour and suddenly I'm teaching it Wednesday nights for 3 hours? Same lesson, but suddenly I have to come up with a different set of activities and engagements. And the space changed that for me. And it's a lot of work to teach in a different space and think about how you're going to engage. So these are the lessons that I took with me going into helping people teach in Mosaic classrooms and helping people teach in active learning classrooms. And so next, I want to talk about some practical approaches for thinking about how to combine your pedagogical approaches with your space. There's the realities of your space. There are 4 approaches that I've used with faculty that they've said have been really helpful to them, and that they have applied themselves. So I want to address that now that I've given you background. But first, I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions.
How do you see this translating into online spaces?
Oh, that's such a good question. What I'm about to talk about will help involves that also can be used for the transition to online spaces. In fact, the 4 approaches that I'm about to share, I had a lot of instructors who were my Mosaic fellows. They worked with me for about 2 semesters, so about nine months. And when the pandemic hit and they were all switching online, I was just informally talking to them, asking them how it was going. And I kept hearing the approaches that we did made going online much easier. They still applied to a virtual environment because we're still in learning environments, even if we're facing each other through the screen. And so a lot of these concepts about engagement, who is privileged, the resources that we have, and how, like, where we are physically as corporeal beings, they all still matter. And so let me talk about those 4 and then address some more specific comments that they made. But that's a really good question. And I will say that I led an initiative about physical classroom spaces. And when the pandemic hit, I thought, how am I going to do this? Because it's all in person, and we were able to move online pretty readily. And I have some notes from that.
Additional question, Dr. Birdwell. This is Dr. Brazelton. Can you define Mosaic?
Oh, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the Mosaic was the initiative that I led at Indiana University. It's not an acronym. And so Mosaic was describing our approach to design for active learning classrooms. So instead of scale up, where a lot of universities took that early notion and built that classroom in many capacities in terms of seating, we did not do scale up at all for most of the period I was there. There were all sorts of classroom designs, different technologies available. So Mosaic represented, I think, the mosaic of different active learning classrooms we had at Indiana. And I like to say the Mosaic was supposed to be about the active learning classrooms, but I would argue the Mosaic initiative was really about teaching in the mosaic of all of our spaces, including our, in air quotes, traditional spaces.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share our practical approaches to thinking about how to teach in all spaces that were inspired by the active learning classrooms that we had. And as a reminder, I led something called the Mosaic Initiative at Indiana University for 10 years. And I had something called the Mosaic Fellows Program, where I would lead cohorts of faculty in thinking about teaching in any kind of learning space across the university. It was multidisciplinary. We would read literature on active learning classrooms, on active learning approaches. And because instructors were so well informed about what was happening at their home campus and what was happening across higher ed, they became this cohort of experts on learning spaces and could really engage our learning spaces team, our Office of the Architect, our AV teams in terms of what they wanted and what they needed, because they were aware not just of what was happening in their spaces, but in their colleague spaces too. So really kind of created an army, I'd like to say an army of informed, passionate advocates for learning spaces. I mentioned this a little bit before, but when I was hired in the Mosaic Initiative, I felt like I was divided in my sort of loyalties. The folks who designed the spaces wanted faculty to use everything in the room. If there was a high-tech touch screen, they wanted everyone using the high-tech touch screen. If the seats could be, you know, moved around the room, they wanted to make sure they were being moved around the room because that's what was built. So I felt there was a lot of pressure to ensure the spaces were used as they were designed in the eyes of the designers. But as an instructor and somebody sympathetic to my colleagues, we also have our pedagogical goals, right? Like we're focused on teaching, we're focused on helping our students think in terms of our disciplinary approaches. And yes, we want the spaces to work for us, but sometimes you build that $100,000 interactive touchscreen, and that doesn't work for me, right? And so what I was doing moving forward, and some of these examples are how to think about teaching in the spaces, exploring what's available, but ultimately landing on what makes sense and what's useful to you. And so these are 4 approaches that I've worked with instructors. I think that you can do them alone, but I also think you could do them as a group of people. So they're all quite simple. So one of the things I would do with instructors, and sometimes I would do this with Mosaic Fellows, or if a classroom was built and it's a brand new space, say a department, or the university wanted to ensure everyone knew how to teach in the space, I would invite everyone who was enrolled to teach in the space for the semester, or, you know, if this was the fellows, I would invite everyone into the room and I would ask them 2 questions. And on the slide in the back behind the woman in the stripes, you can see that there are 2 questions there. And this is what they read. In this classroom, what tools are you most likely to use? And in this classroom, what tools are you least likely to use? 2 very simple questions. But the most important thing is I asked everyone to touch everything in the room, touch all the buttons, pick up the chairs, sit in, you know, most spaces in the room, and explore some technology that you haven't used before. And I define technology as like a pencil is a technology, and so is a phone, or, you know, a smartphone. And so what would happen is instructors would have very strong ideas about what they do use or what they don't use. But in speaking with their peers and touching things with their peers and turning on, turning off, critiquing, admiring, the sort of the gamut of being in the space, they would share ideas. And I'd like to say one of 2 things happened. One, they would either learn about, you know, some sort of tool or technology or approach that they had not learned of from their peers, which was useful. And the other thing is they would reaffirm why they maybe weren't using the dot cam. Like, this doesn't work for me. They were learning what makes sense for them. And so this was a really useful approach. And I've had a lot of instructors say they actually, before they teach in every new classroom, they do this. They actually go in the room, sit in all the spaces, actually touch and pick everything up so they understand what the experience of students are. It's very simple, but a lot of times the first time we enter a new classroom is the first day of class. This is something I've used for larger classrooms. We've seen this photo before, but now this is another angle. I call it the blueprint walk, although I've used it in smaller classrooms too. So you can see on the right, that's an actual blueprint of the room. I just asked the Learning Spaces team if I could have access, and that's pretty easy to get in university. And I would have a group of instructors, and I would give everybody a piece of paper and a pen with this blueprint. And I would say, I want you to walk around the entire room, and I want you to identify with a circle the places you think you'll most likely be in the classroom. And I want you to X the spaces you think, I don't want to stay here, or I'm not going to stay here, or this is not a good spot for me. And this could be really instructive. And then I would ask, first of all, you kind of get a feel of the room. and sit in every space, stand in every corner, and really think about the space in a way that you might not have before. I bring everyone together, and then that's where like new ideas form. Like, for example, on the right, you can see that a fellow historian like me had circled 2 spaces where she could actually kind of hide a little bit while she invited her students to engage in activities. And she said, well, I had a male instructor say, why would you hide from your students? And she said, well, sometimes they see me as mom. They want to ask a question or get help. And sometimes I want to encourage them to push a little bit more. So she would hide. And the other instructor was really surprised by that, and he had not experienced that before. And then he said a couple of weeks later, he tried, kind of staying out of view as well. So that could be a really interesting way to engage and discuss how we all use space and learn how we use spaces differently. But the blueprint walk is really useful for getting people to consider the entire room as they prepare their lessons. This is useful, but also useful for going online too. So you could be thinking about this for a face-to-face course, and you could use this activity for an online course. But this is how I help people think about using a classroom and moving between classroom with different tools. This is all of us are in one classroom together, experiencing this together. And I'm having everyone do a think, pair, share. And the think, pair, share is what does active learning look like? Like draw it, like what does it look like visually? In the table and chairs version, those are the tools they're using. That's what we have, very low tech space. They're describing verbally what active learning looks like in their discipline. The second one is like glass boards or whiteboards, writing surfaces. So they draw, and of course they've got like stick figures. And the other one is like a digital experience, and they're accessing the internet. We do the same prompt with different tools, and they all have the exact same amount of time. I want to say 10 minutes. And what happens is the process is totally different. The time needed is totally different, but we all have the same prompt. And then that sort of creates a discussion about how I can adjust activities or how I need to adjust activities as I go between modalities or between different classrooms. And so it was really useful way to kind of help people think about like logistics and class planning and how can I make small adjustments to teaching in different environments. And finally, and again, this one does make sense in the context of being in a physical classroom and then pivoting to an online space. One of the things I would ask faculty to do when I was working with them in classes is I would ask them to bring like their favorite lesson or a lesson that they wanted to work on, like an activity within a class. And so we would wind up in a classroom and I would say, imagine you're doing that activity in this classroom. How would you approach it? Which tools would you use? How would that work? And how long would it take? How would your students work? How would they share? How would you group them? And then without sort of letting them know this would happen, I would walk down the hall and take them to another classroom with totally different tools and say, how would you do it in this classroom? Right. And then we would talk and discuss. And then I found that it really helped create like this muscle, this ability to transform, change, make minor adjustments to your course, and also make it fun. Because if you can do one activity a couple different ways, even if you stay in the same room, it might keep the teaching fresh for you too over time. And so those are a couple of approaches. Feel free to use them individually or like as a group, but these are really helpful for thinking about how to teach in different classrooms, go between, say, an active learning classroom in a traditional space, or even a face-to-face situation and an online situation. One of the pieces of feedback I received from faculty going through these activities and reflecting on their classrooms is they said that they had developed a lens. Like every time they went to a classroom, they immediately started thinking about how to leverage the classroom for their teaching. And they said they did that from doing these activities on, and had always done that. And in doing these activities, they said that they use those skills, those sort of muscle memory, to go totally online when we had to, very quickly. So to me, the irony in thinking about our physical spaces and how to teach in them, and to really think about what the interactions are, how I can make minor adjustments in those interactions when I teach in different spaces, or I don't know, the technology doesn't work that day and we have to suddenly pivot to whiteboards. That's what helped them teach online. That's what helped them upskill and transition. And I had a lot of the Mosaic Fellows say they didn't have any problems suddenly going online, which to me is a remarkable unintended consequence of thinking more deeply about our physical spaces, especially having to leave them. I'm going to take another moment for questions. So I'll just move on a little bit and we can save questions for the end. And I also want to share how instructors engage their students once they found themselves in these active learning classrooms, and frankly also engaged active learning classrooms and went back to traditional spaces too. Instructors started asking their students about their experience in these spaces and started getting incredible feedback about teaching in any space for themselves. I had this one instructor, it was education, so of course there was some reflection about how students and instructors engage as part of the curriculum. But since he was in active learning classrooms and was thinking about the space and space use, he started asking his students to think about the space use. So he would ask students to draw a typical day, which, by the way, incredible feedback as an instructor, but also inspired for them to think about what learning in the space to metacognitively think about learning in that space. I also have, this is sort of one of my favorite stories from working with faculty in spaces. I had an instructor who wanted to learn more about how the space impacted her students and how she could transform the space. And so for her midterm evaluation, instead of asking like, how's the class going? How could I be helping you? She directed those classrooms about the room and she asked, how is this room helping your learning? And how is this room, which is an active learning classroom, hindering your learning? And she said she actually received some of the best midterm evaluation feedback she ever had, because in asking about the physical classroom, students felt like they were commenting on the classroom and less on her and the course, for those who felt like they maybe didn't want to say something negative. But allowing students to direct their thoughts in the class, thinking about how the space helps their learning and how the room was utilized, really allowed them to think about how they were learning and convey their thoughts and needs to the instructor so she could make some different choices or reaffirm the same choices moving forward. So I can't express this as a valuable, simple tool enough. And finally, we just started asking students, what was it like to learn in an active learning classroom? We actually had a student write a blog for us. And it turns out they really do notice the difference. This one saw the active learning classroom as frankly a peer in her course and some an intervention that really helped her learning. So as you move forward with your active learning classrooms, I highly recommend encouraging student involvement and student conversation around their experiences in the space. In fact, there was so much traction with students and so many faculty were talking about active learning classrooms. I was requested to make a slide deck to go in front of the Board of Trustees at Indiana for because so many students were speaking about it. So it's something to think in terms of how you're sharing the narrative of how you're approaching the space at your university. And after a few years, I started doing these design symposiums. I brought instructors from all of the campuses together and we started exploring what our classroom needs were. I would give them images from classrooms around the world, not unlike I shared with you today, and ask small groups of instructors to say, you know, if you were building a small classroom, money, no object, what would you build? And so I would ask people across disciplines to co-create a classroom together. I know it's really hard to see, but on the far right, I like to call him the man in black, and he's not Johnny Cash, but he's one of our room designers. And so I would have instructors create rooms, talk about rooms, how they would teach rooms, but I would bring our learning spaces team, our AV people in on these conversations. And so I could engage instructors and people who built the rooms together so we could inform the building of future rooms. In fact, the design symposiums became so popular that we were invited all to come to Bloomington and share the faculty designs in front of the architect's office so they could get some ideas. So in building some classrooms and having faculty rethink what they need in the traditional spaces, we were able to really create and move forward a faculty-focused discussion across campus about our learning spaces and make changes based on real faculty needs and approaches. And in fact, we began engaging students in the design symposiums too, asking them what they would want in a classroom and getting a student perspective on how we design spaces. And I mentioned this before, but the number one request from faculty, more whiteboards. So one of the big effects of building these like really high-tech active learning classrooms is we actually focused on bringing low-tech options to more classrooms across the campus, which I actually think is a win because faculty would use those tools. One of the things I want to leave you all with are 3 practical, thoughtful articles that you might wish to read in the future if you have a reading group. These are robust enough articles to take a whole hour to really discuss and share ideas, or you could read them as a group. The Chen, Coppridge, and Putman. Chen is exploring how an active learning classroom, which could be a very busy and distracting space, right, if everyone is engaged and talking. Chen explores different ways you could leverage that busyness to create more informal peer interaction. Coppridge, to be full disclosure, that's my research team, and we actually interviewed faculty at IU for different ways that they change their teaching after teaching in an active learning classroom. So there's a lot of great quotes from instructors' experience there. And then last one, if you pick one, please read this last one. Putman explored some of the, looking at different ways to use different types of seating, more informal seating options, like chairs that moved a bit more, different, more informal, sort of almost beanbag type chairs. And she actually was teaching her own course and found that different types of students would gravitate towards this differentiated seating, which really supported Hispanic students were particularly attracted to them. And also students who are on the spectrum tend to gravitate and find these chairs most helpful for a variety of reasons. So I wanted to share these 3 with you, and I can't express enough how useful. There are some ideas that you could immediately put into your courses and reading these articles. And I think that they could be useful articles to leverage for broader conversations about space and maybe what your space needs are going to be in the future. So I'm going to see, however, you may wish to have questions, but I wanted you all to kind of revisit your definition in just a moment. But for now, I wanted to say thank you. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to address questions as we move forward. And Jamie, thank you for sharing the articles there. And please note that there are notes in the slides, and you're welcome to the slides, and you can access the articles through the slides too.
Jamie, I think you need to share those articles. I think I went in and there needs to be still a share of those.
Yes, I'm going through. If you request access, I'll give you access to it. It doesn't work. The notebook, sharing the notebook LM doesn't, there's not a feature that I can see right away that it's my first time trying with sharing the notebook LM sources. But I will get those in there.
So I see a question from Katie in the Q&A. In your feedback from students, do you remember any responses from students that surprised you or seemed to hinder them in any way? I'm thinking about students who might struggle with communication and or social skills. Yeah, let me get out of that. So a couple of surprising responses. Do you remember that very large classroom at IU that I showed you, and there was a blueprint? There was one response that really caused everyone pause, because the biggest response that a couple of people said is, I really love that this room has 3 exits. And that was wow, okay, they're thinking about that. And so that stood out, because so much effort was made, and like, we can engage, and the students have microphones on the desks and everything, and to imagine that like safety was such an issue. I would say this, that some of those, especially those classrooms where students talk about being able to see one another, makes them feel like they're in a collaborative environment. And in that article, that Coppridge article, I would argue that one of the key takeaways is that students said when they could see each other, they really could see each other. An instructor spoke about, she taught a class about incarceration in America in that course. And that's, of course, a sensitive topic that can lead to like a lot of sensitive reveals. And she said that instead of teaching the course in a lecture hall, teaching a course where they were kind of facing each other in circles, she said she found a couple of things. And it says this in the article. One, she said that the students started naming each other in the conversations. And so, Susan might say something, and then, I don't know, like Joe would say, I want to build on what Susan said. And so they were engaging each other and acknowledging each other's thoughts instead of totally focusing on the instructor and, instructor, student. They started to talk with one another more and engage each other, even in the class discussions. And she said that students felt like they could talk about their experiences being assumed to be, incarcerated, or their experiences in this type of environment, because they felt like they could be seen and be thought of. It wasn't like speaking to kind of the whole audience. So there was something about seeing each other allowed them to be more seen. And then that article also talks about the kitchen table-ness of some of these classrooms. With the chairs around, the instructor would often grab a chair and just kind of sit down with the students. And the feeling of a kitchen table was brought up on many occasions. That metaphor was brought up. And I've never said anything like that, but people were separately in interviews bringing up the kitchen table. And the Putman article, I love that she was asking students why they would choose the, sort of the furniture that can rock. And there were a lot of different instances. And she said the students would say, well, actually, I'm on the spectrum, but I don't want to know. And I don't really report it to the Disability Resource Center. But being able to choose my furniture, and furniture I can kind of move just a little bit, allows me to focus and be safe in the space. And I don't have to disclose. And because some people approach it like that. And so there's a lot of stories of, I can kind of find my spot in the classroom, even though it's a busier space. I might maybe sit in the table that's off to the side, but there's a little bit more choices. That's kind of what I'm seeing in the research and reporting. Oh, this is another Q&A. Yeah, John, that reminds me, there's a great article also by Victoria Chen. I want to say if you searched Victoria Chen pulpit and classroom, she researched TAs using the classroom, and the TA who kind of like rearranged the classroom and worked throughout the student classroom versus the classroom where the TA just stayed in front of the front of the room, which would be a totally normal response, right? I'm not trying to put down anyone who doesn't rearrange space and become sort of guide on the side the first time they ever taught. So there's some really thoughtful comments there. And it's been a while since I read the article. I'm trying to apologies, I'm trying to remember the title, but Victoria Chen is the scholar, and I think very highly of her. I think one of the things we used to do with some of our active learning classrooms is I would create a couple of photos of different ways to arrange the room. And I put it in a blog, like we have this mosaic blog, which was my way of not having too much on a website, right? It's a blog, but we could link to the blog and say, this classroom that you're teaching in, it can be arranged these places. So what would happen is we would go to the registrar and get all the emails of people teaching in a space. And it could just be a traditional space too. And then send an email that said, hey, by the way, you may not have thought about this. Here's a couple of options. And also for rooms, and we would like number and label them like 1A, 2B, or whatever. And we would say, you can always grab these photos and send them out to the students and say, next class, could you rearrange it like thusly? And so I think adjuncts will often, of course, find out they're teaching a course like right before, the week of, even the week after the semester has started. So that could be a challenge to really get information to folks and to give people, frankly, very much to digest, like very early on. But we found reported that people enjoyed very much just the suggestion of here are some options for moving the classroom around. Also, if you don't have markers available, this is who you contact. Like there's just a little bit of support for thinking about the space went a long way, no matter who was teaching in the room. But that was one of the lowest hanging fruit way to reach adjuncts too. And of course, we would say, come contact us if you want us to help you think about the space. I also would say that, when I first worked with people in these spaces, the pressure was to get people to use the technology. But I found that the best way to get people to really get up and use the space was to direct them to the whiteboards. Because if you haven't really engaged before your students, you haven't asked them to get up before, maybe you haven't thought about like a short assignment or activity design. Maybe you're not really sure how to convene them back. How many markers do you give? Like all this sort of like logistics planning at a whiteboard where you can pretty much guarantee it works, right? You just need functioning markers and a couple of erasers. I almost felt like getting instructors used to that type of engagement open the door to the digital technologies should they go that direction. I personally am completely agnostic if you're using this technology or this technology. And I think that attitude too of whatever you use in the room that supports your teaching is the right technology to use. Please don't feel like you have to use anything. But for those who are encouraging folks to use other things, I found just giving people experiences at the whiteboard themselves through activities really help them think, yeah, I could do this in a class. The next thing you know, they're more comfortable using a technology once they've mastered like the classroom, navigating.
Have you seen in your research that these active learning spaces may have a significant impact on like historically underserved populations or at-risk populations? I just wondering in your research what you've been able to see as far as that is concerned.
Yes, and I can share over the weekend. I can share some articles with you. I just need to get through a busy week, but I can touch base over the weekend about it. But those are the groups who seem to be most served. A sense of belonging, a sense of proximity to the instructor, a sense that you can actually kind of practice in class often an idea, so you don't feel isolated, start to self-isolate. The sense that you belong there because you are experiencing everything that someone else is experiencing. You're not in the back of the room or feeling like you're in front of the room. I also appreciate you're always fighting the battle of the tiered classroom, because in a tiered classroom, a lot of times if somebody can't navigate stairs, there's one place for them to sit, right? And in some cases, there's a front and back. But whatever you can do to make sure you can sit anywhere, or at least if there's some slightly differentiated seating, that the choices, you get to make choices and you're happy with the choices that you make. But yes, in terms of belonging is huge. And I think that has to do with feeling like you're part of like a community, as opposed to showing up and everyone's anonymous and we all bring our own sort of perspectives and experience to that kind of sense of anonymity too. that anonymity can reinforce a lot of ideas.
Thank you.
Can I ask you all a question? What do you see as like the biggest possibilities with your active learning classrooms? Like, what are you most excited about?
I'm challenged now to try to figure out how to, I've got very long tables in my classroom that are pretty set. So first thinking about a redesign.
Mm,
And that I think is the first step for me, So I do use whiteboard, and I do have them circle around very large tables. So seeing if there's anything else. So my ticker's going, thinking about, is there any other ways that I can redesign,
yeah.
before moving on?
Let me share this with you too. There is a set of whiteboards I use, and every time I use them, people go, "Where do you get that?" I'm going to immediately buy them. So I can send you a link. It may be like a big retailer. You can go find them anywhere. They're really cheap. But imagine whiteboards that are about the size of a blank piece of paper, slightly bigger, and it's a box of markers and erasers. And if you can't quite get to your students and it's hard because you don't, people have to rub up against each other, and that doesn't make anybody feel good. But it is easy to kind of say, ask a question and then ask everybody to publicly commit an answer by holding something up. And you could kind of see that there are different ways when you're sort of trapped. Like that's the least fun, is you kind of sit down and you can't really get up unless you're finally getting up. So there's some options to make people's voices heard and be seen. And I think they're actually really great to use in pairs too, which means you get people talking. I love the idea of like using a tool and then using a different tool next week, because I have this, I want people to not feel like they can go on autopilot in my class. So just enough change to keep it interesting, but there's like a fundamental, we will be sharing ideas.
That'd be nice. Yeah, I have the erasable markers, and they use like large white paper, sometimes in groups.
Yes.
But the whiteboard would be a lot cheaper in the long run.
Yeah. I also have a trick where, and you can do this with 2 people, and you can do this with like 6. I'm usually doing it with like 6, where I make sure I have different color markers. And I like to say, all right, I want to see a rainbow of participation.
Nice.
So you get, I don't know, 6 people, 6 markers. I should see all the colors, and that's a great way where I can kind of go, Maddie, where's red? Maddie's red, and it's a way to kind of nudge something. So sometimes it's 1 marker per 6, and other times it's everyone, but it's to kind of change it up and create like the gentle expectation that everyone would participate. And it could just be one person is starring something or underlining something. Give people a chance to give a voice, but also not to have pressure to give the key voice.
That is good. That is good.
I did create an observation protocol for active learning classrooms, and I can share that with you. But it was more like, are you leveraging the space like to meet your goals, and not to get you to use the room, but if you say that your objective is X or Y, and it would have been really helpful to use the dot cam. It could be a way to kind of help you to think it through. But the observation protocol, I also tested on online classes too. So I love the idea that these discussions and arguments about physical space do not exclude our virtual spaces, because that is also a learning environment our students are in.
I think we
Thank-
have time for maybe one more question. Have you ever worked with universities who might have been able to trade tables or chairs that would work better in the other school?
Like if they,
Hold on. I'll see, and I'll get Kendra to be able to do that. Hold on just a second.
oh, like, oh, you mean like would the university allow like operations? Yeah, that sounds like an operations or a learning spaces question.
Oh,
I will say very quickly, I'll tell you my favorite story ever.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, like if maybe the university had something that would work better for another school, and that school had something that would work better that the other school needs, and they decided it was okay that they swapped and they swapped because I know budgets are all
Yes.
great right now. So has that ever come up as something that was possible?
I think if you were to do that, you need to make sure the registrar knows because they have
Oh yeah,
to.
yeah. Oh, totally. Like with everybody on board.
It's like operations or whoever is kind of in charge, but that is a brilliant way to say we propose, and this is no cost. And on a sunny day, we'll happily move that. I mean, if there's heavy tables, you might need assistance, but I think, boy, that's a brilliant idea. I have not seen that.
Yeah, and I don't know if that would ever like if the stars would ever align to make that work. Another thing that I know, again, I don't know if this would ever align, but a way that you might be able to get lesser expensive things to
Mhm.
modify classrooms is I follow online auctions,
Yeah.
and sometimes that's the way, like high schools, if they're like, God forbid, like if they're closing a school or consolidating
Yeah.
schools and they might be doing it in your area, they get rid of stuff and it's really inexpensive. And especially like if it might be a middle school or even a high school that has some of those adaptable tables and
Mhm.
like things like that, that could be a way to get some affordable things when I know they're really expensive sometimes to start with, but yeah, I was just curious if you'd ever found some clever, affordable ways to work around, finding some of those great suggested tables and things that you can rearrange or you can do different things with in the classroom.
I think if you own it's like a departmental space, or even if it's like a conference room and you're able to bring stuff because you do have control into a space, then suddenly it's at the university and it's easier to move somewhere else, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because, well, we already used it. We've been using it for a year. Is it okay if we put it in this other space? I think that's
Right.
also a path to bringing in
That's true.
new tools.
Thank you, Kendra. That was a really good question and some really good comments. I'm noticing our participants are going down and I'm noticing our time, and I know many of us have class at 12:30, and that absolutely does not reflect on Dr. Birdwell at all. She, as a teacher, understands, oh, that 12:30 time slot, a time. So I just want to say thank you, Dr. Birdwell. This has been just so pleasant. Just thank you for sharing your time and your expertise and your insights on this topic with us today. This has been very valuable. We do truly appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Oh my gosh, I just absolutely love that 500-seat circular auditorium. I mean, I can't get that out of my head, and I won't for a while. And I would just love to be teaching in a space like that. That would be great. To our attendees today, thank you for joining us and for your thoughtful questions and engagement throughout this session. It's just been really enjoyable to be here today with all of you. We hope that you're leaving with some practical strategies that you can try in your own teaching, regardless of what kind of space and technology that you have in your learning environment. So please watch your email for a session feedback survey. Once you complete the survey, you'll be able to download your PD certificate of participation. If you have any follow-up questions for Dr. Birdwell or for any of our subcommittee members, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always happy to continue these conversations. I also want to give one more thank you to our Curriculum and Student Learning Subcommittee for organizing this session and bringing Dr. Birdwell in today, and for their ongoing work to support teaching and learning across our campus. We hope to see you at future events, and just have a great rest of your day, everyone, and goodbye, everyone. So thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks.